Reading the Times for February 29th, Saturday. Coronavirus fears reverberate around global economy. Investors, fearing that the spread of the coronavirus is tipping the global economy into a recession, handed the stock market its largest weekly loss since the 2008 financial crisis on Friday, amid worries that one of the longest economic expansions in history may be coming to an end. As the stock market dropped again on Friday, Jerome H. Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, issued a short statement affirming that the central bank would use its tools and act as appropriate to support the economy. After the Fed statement, the S&P 500 pared some of its losses, closing the day down 0.8%, though the index remained down 11.5% for the week. Such fears do not bode well for a modern economy and stock market that depend on optimism and a willingness to spend. Why this Trump-leaning corner of South Carolina has the jitters, though the upstate region still defined by evangelical religion and social conservatism, and its 1.5 million residents heavily supported President Trump in the 2016 election. His tariffs and trade disputes with China, South Carolina's #1 export market, and Germany have given business leaders 3 years of intermittent dyspepsia. Mr. Trump may have been smacked in the upstate's golden goose around a little bit, but Mr. Sanders takes the axe to the head of the golden goose and cuts it off, said David Britt, a Spartanburg city commissioner and vice president and general manager of Tyndall Corporation, a locally based maker of precast construction components. At the Arts Council and elsewhere, residents wondered whether opening the upstate region to global commerce has nudged it toward a new social liberalism. Democratic rivals are fighting over Obama. He has some opinions. A pro-Trump super PAC A pro-Trump super PAC aired a deceptive TV ad earlier this week manipulating a 1995 Obama audiobook to make it appear that Mr. Obama was accusing Mr. Biden of betraying black voters. In South Carolina, Mr. Biden has intensified his Joe Hart's Barack strategy, weaponizing the president's popularity as a battering ram to punish Mr. Sanders and Mr. Bloomberg for making Mr. Obama sweat for their support in 2012. In a recently unearthed audio recording of a 2016 speech, Mr. Bloomberg claimed to have given Mr. Obama a backhanded endorsement. Mr. Richmond added it was hypocrisy for Mr. Bloomberg and Mr. Sanders to run ads saying they were BFFs with Mr. Obama after refusing to help out Obama when he needed them. Trump accuses media and Democrats of exaggerating coronavirus threat. President Trump and members of his administration mobilized on Friday to confront the threat of the coronavirus. Not just the outbreak, but the news media and the Democrats they accused of exaggerating its danger. His eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., even accused the president's opponents of wishing for widespread deaths from the virus, citing a New York Times columnist who wrote that the illness should be called Trump virus. For them to try to take a pandemic and seemingly hope that it comes here and kills millions of people so they can end Donald Trump's streak of winning is a new level of sickness, he told Fox News from the conservative conference. Court rules Congress cannot sue to force executive branch officials to testify. The absence of a judicial remedy does not render Congress powerless, he wrote, adding Congress can wield these political weapons without dragging judges into the fray. Because Judge Henderson joined Judge Griffith in asserting that Congress could not file lawsuits to enforce its subpoenas in the first place, it did not matter. A federal district court judge rejected the absolute immunity theory in a 2008 case, involving a congressional investigation into Bush administration firings of United States attorneys, one of the first lawsuits by Congress to enforce a subpoena for executive branch information. In China's war on the coronavirus, a community is besieged. Looking back, residents of Zhuoling pointed to lapses that they said let the virus quietly spread. Miss Ling said she believed that her daughter had been infected in the local branch of the Zhongbai supermarket chain, the only major food store in the neighborhood, which was crowded before the holiday. Even as official warnings grew louder, older people in Zhuoling walked around and socialized without masks because they did not grasp the need or could not buy them, some residents said. Many maintenance workers and guards for housing management companies in Zhuoling quit as the worry about the virus grew, leaving them short of employees to disinfect and clean, said residents and security guards. At a bar made by Africans, migrants put down roots in Mexico. The coolest dive bar in southern Mexico, or at least the coolest one founded by migrants from Cameroon, was hidden in a mostly residential neighborhood in Tepachula, a city near the border with Guatemala. On February night, he was one of about a dozen patrons, all African migrants, who were drinking beer at the bar and tucking into plates of spaghetti and plantains prepared in a makeshift kitchen. Everyone came to the bar because it was the most animated bar in the center of town, said Mr. Elad, who worked as a sound engineer in Cameroon. Ukraine is threatening to arrest its former president. The Ukrainian police on Friday questioned Ukraine's former president, Poroshenko, after threatening to arrest him if he failed to appear in what a growing chorus of critics, including the European Union, says is a politically motivated vendetta. Mr. Poroshenko is not just a former president, but also a prominent political opponent of President Volodymyr Zelensky, who won election last spring on an anti-corruption platform that included a pledge to end politically motivated investigations. The Ukrainian police are investigating whether Mr. Poroshenko committed crimes by agreeing to a series of steps in the settlement deal that allowed local elections before restoration of Ukrainian control of separatist territories. China spins coronavirus crisis, hailing itself as a global leader. Party officials have tried to spin the crises as a testament to the strength of China's authoritarian system and its hard-line leader, Xi Jinping, even announcing plans to publish a book in 6 languages about the outbreak that portrays him as a major power leader with care for the people. Mr. Xi, China's most influential leader since Mao, has made it a priority to expand the country's economic and military might around the world and to demonstrate that China can play the role of responsible superpower. Nonetheless, due to the ideological and political prejudice against China, American elites don't believe China's moves and experience are reliable and helpful. It's not the plague, but Milan isn't itself either. The plague has already entered Milan, Alessandro Manzoni wrote in The Betrothed, the 19th century Italian literary classic renowned for its vivid descriptions of the 1630 pestilence that gutted Milan. In the novel, dreaded cartmen wind their way through Milan street and purposefully let fall from the carts infected clothes in order to propagate and keep up this pestilence, which has become to them a means of living, a kingdom, a festival. Manzoni writes that the city, already tumultuously inclined, was now turned upside down. The outbreak of the coronavirus in and around Milan is light years from the horrors of the plague, and for now only just over a dozen people have died, and they were elderlier with serious underlying health conditions. Italy's quarantine leaves lockdown towns feeling a sacrifice. The phone calls came from inside one of the northern Italian towns quarantined to contain the rapid spread of the coronavirus. Northern Italy has taken an aggressive response to the spread of the virus, testing and quarantining people with and without symptoms, locking down 11 towns and more than 50,000 people as officials desperately seek to seal the virus off from the rest of Italy. As the virus spreads, the situation inside the lockdown towns and on the ambiguous and sometimes porous borders between the free and the quarantined offers a potential preview of what may come if countries, including the United States, choose to confront the virus with a similar hard line. He drove her to the hospital. she gave him the coronavirus. About a week later, Mr. Thongsu, 50, tested positive for the coronavirus that has been spreading across the globe from China and has infected at least 41 people in Thailand. Mr. Thongsu grew up in Thailand's northeast, the country's rice basket. Thailand's public health minister, Anutin Charnvirakul, who checked in with Mr. Thongsu twice in the hospital, praised him for his healthy habits. Nigeria responds to first coronavirus case in sub-Saharan Africa. An Italian contractor who flew into Nigeria from Milan became sub-Saharan Africa's first confirmed coronavirus patient on Friday, stoking concern that an outbreak on the continent could overwhelm already strained healthcare systems. Public health officials have been warning that the coronavirus could be devastating in Africa, a continent with relatively weak healthcare and disease surveillance systems. Global health experts have anticipated that the virus would most likely spread to Africa from China, which has increased its ties with Africa enormously over the past 2 decades. After a face-off in Syria, Turkey and Russia tried to pull back from the brink. Turkey vowed on Friday to resist further aggression against its troops in northwestern Syria, a day after Russian or Syrian air and artillery strikes killed 33 Turkish soldiers, bringing Russia and Turkey closer to open conflict. Turkey's defense minister, Hulusi Akar, said the attack was carried out even though the Turkish troops had coordinated their location with Russian forces on the ground. Reports from the scene describe a Russian jet striking a Turkish convoy, and then artillery strikes pounding Turkish troops in several buildings. Turkey, pressing EU for help in Syria, threatens to open borders to refugees. If Turkey's leader does mean business, he will open not only the border to Greece, but also the border with Syria, where he has blocked several 100,000 would-be refugees as fighting has intensified in the area of Idlib. Mr. Erdogan believes the West should give his military more air support in Syria and his civil ministries more aid inside Turkey, where his government looks after more than 3 million Syrian refugees, more than any other country. The consequence of events all but unravels a pact made in March 2016 between Turkey and the European Union, which prompted Mr. Erdogan to successfully end most migrant smuggling between Turkey and Greece. Actors walk out after Roman Polanski wins Best Director at France's Oscars. Roman Polanski, the film director who fled the United States in 1978 while awaiting sentencing for having sex with a 13-year-old, was a big winner Friday night at the Césars, France equivalent of the Academy Awards, despite outrage over his nominations. A very few people applauded Mr. Polanski's Best Director award, said Le Monde, a French newspaper, and some stars walked out. Mr. Polanski pulled out of the 2017 awards for the same reason. As Israel votes again and again, Arabs see opportunity. Arabs make up 17% of eligible voters in Israel. Arab voters have no shortage of grievances against Mr. Netanyahu, his support for settlements and annexation of West Bank land. After years of opposing the Oslo peace process, his enactment of 2018 law that demoted the status of the Arabic language and said only Jews have national self-determination rights in Israel, and his race baiting over the past year, including claiming that Arabs want to annihilate all of us, women, children, men. Arab turnout has generally been on the decline since Israel's early days under martial law, when historians said Arab citizens felt pressured to vote. An Israeli politician, political aide, confided to his rabbi he was being recorded. On Wednesday, Rabbi Havura was a key participant of a meeting Mr. Haddad arranged for Mr. Netanyahu at a yeshiva in Tel Aviv. During that meeting, Rabbi Havura led yeshiva students in a prayer for Mr. Netanyahu to win a governing majority of 61 seats in parliament on Monday's vote. He's got everything. Crooked rabbis. Leaks of a photo of the rabbi with Bibi the day before is brilliant, said Anshel Pfeiffer, a political columnist for Haaretz. Netanyahu has corrupted even the relationship of trust between a man and his rabbi, Mr. Gantz wrote on Twitter. Jimmy Lai, Hong Kong media baron, is arrested over role in protest. The unexpected high-profile arrests, which took place at the activist's home, were made as Hong Kong, already rocked by months of protests last year, battled to contain the coronavirus outbreak, which has fueled panic and further distrust of the authorities. The arrest on Friday morning came after the arrest of more than 7,000 demonstrators since June, as part of the Hong Kong government's campaign to clamp down on the protest movement. China has worked relentlessly to vilify Mr. Lai, who has provided a powerful, wide-reaching platform to the mostly young and leaderless protesters in Hong Kong. In a Facebook post on Friday, the Labour Party in Hong Kong confirmed that the police had arrested its vice chairman, Lee Cheuk-yan, a longtime democracy advocate, over his role in the August 31st march. An artist who aspires to be a bone in everyone's throat. The release of the video, in which Mr. Pawlewski described as the first act of a new artistic series called Porno Politica, forced the married politician to drop out of the race and left the Russian artist facing preliminary charges for violation of privacy and publishing sexual images without consent. Mr. Pawlewski has also been heartened by the reaction of ordinary French people who stop him on the street to express support. Mr. Pawlewski repeated his fire act after arriving in Paris, setting alight windows at the entrance of the Banque de France, the French National Bank, which said it had established itself as an enemy of the people by providing money to fund the bloody repression of the Paris Commune in 1871. For this, he spent 11 months in a French prison, much of it in solitary confinement. Journalist murder puts a tycoon and a nation on trial. The prosecutor's case file, which runs about 25,000 pages, also alleges a sordid nexus between Mr. Kochner and the country's political elite, the same line of reporting that Mr. Kuciak's journalism pursued. Most billionaires don't enjoy the luxury Marian Kochner and his family did, Mr. Toth told the court, describing the week he spent with the businessman on his yacht in Croatia in 2017. I'm glad I went there, he said, because it made me understand what Mr. Kochner has to lose. We used to argue with my son sometimes, he told the court, adding that he voted for and trusted SMER. That is why I hadn't believed the threats from Mr. Kochner in the beginning. I thought it was nothing like that could happen here, since we had functional prosecution, courts, and police. Terrorism threat in West Africa soars as U.S. weighs troop cut. China now has more embassies in Africa than the United States, 52 to 49. The U.S. is losing the competition in Africa against China, Russia, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State, said Catherine Zimmerman, an analyst with the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. Any reduction in the U.S. military presence in West Africa would have real and lasting negative consequences for our African partners. Senator James M. Inhofe, an Oklahoma Republican who heads the Armed Services Committee, said in a statement last week during a trip to Africa that included a brief stop at Nouakchott, Mauritania's seaside capital. In Mauritania, a vast parched nation of about 4.5 million people at the western end of the Sahara that straddles the divide between largely Arab North Africa and Black West Africa, playing host to this year's exercise underscored its commitment to combat Al-Qaeda, diplomats and commanders said. Snow days. Is school canceled more often now? From Hancock, Michigan, where there's snow on the ground nearly 200 days a year, but school children rarely get a wintry day off, to tropical Miami, where a hurricane day is more likely. One thing is clear to students: life is not fair. What are snow days? If it's snowing, it can't really be cold. In Wisconsin, we've very occasionally had school canceled for cold days, when the wind chill was below -40 and creaky school buses failed to start. If more days are canceled, students can be given 5 blizzard bag days before they have to add an extra day in class. Unexplained coronavirus cases in 3 states raise specter of spread. I'm middling alarmed, Mr. Lodwick, an engineer, said as he listed the provisions he bought on Thursday after learning that a woman from his county, Solano, was believed to be the first person in the United States to test positive for the coronavirus without having a known connection to others with the illness. The woman, whose identity was not released by state and local officials in a series of news conferences about the cases, who is the 60th person in the United States to test positive for the virus, which has killed 2,800 people and sickened 82,000 more worldwide. Dr. Bella T. Matias, the public health officer at Solano County, said officials had begun monitoring dozens of people with whom the woman had interacted in recent weeks, including relatives, co-workers, and others she might have had contact with through her job, and asked them to quarantine themselves at home. Government eyes war powers to speed medical manufacturing ahead of virus. Mr. Azar said that if the coronavirus began spreading in communities in the United States, those showing mild symptoms of the virus should stay home rather than seek help at hospitals to avoid the risk of overcrowding health facilities. The raising of war powers in the face of spreading virus appeared to change the tone of the White House response, even as senior Trump officials continue to play down the prospect of a widespread infection. 3 Republican senators who have taken hard lines on border policy invoked the virus to call for stricter border controls. When an epidemic looms, gagging scientists is a terrible idea. On Friday, the president of the Service Employees International Union, which represents 2 million healthcare workers, accused Mr. Trump of jeopardizing its members' health by playing down the epidemic's severity. The administration must immediately reverse course and allow public health experts to lead a nationally coordinated response, said the SEIU president, Mary Kay Henry. Introducing a political siege between the scientists and the public undermines the public's right to know the truth about health threats they face, said Dr. Keith Martin, executive director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. Confusion on the border as appeals court rules against Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. A federal court on Friday upended a central pillar of the Trump administration's immigration agenda, ruling that asylum seekers must be allowed into the United States while their cases weave through American immigration courts. A 3-judge panel in the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco blocked a policy that has required people applying for asylum at the border to wait in Mexico while their claims for protection are reviewed, a process that often takes months or years. The court found that the policy runs counter to asylum law, which states that people can apply for status regardless of where they enter the country. At CPAC, it's now an all-Trump show. Donald J. Trump was still a New York businessman when he was booed at the Conservative Political Action Conference in 2015 after he proposed fighting ISIS with troops on the ground in the Middle East. Flash forward 5 years, and there was no room at the annual conservative conferences this week for booing of anything related to President Trump, including the procession of his adult children and their spouses who appeared here on Friday to bash socialism and make the case for his re-election. Mr. Trump will return to the conference on Saturday, but he was well represented, as he had been for the past 4 years at the conference. We have almost every member of the Trump family, Matt Schlapp, the chairman of CPAC, said in an interview with the conference's green room, where Donald Trump Jr. and Kimberly Guilfoyle, his girlfriend and the national chairwoman for the Trump Victory Finance Committee, mingled before taking the stage. Trump taps John Ratcliffe for Director of National Intelligence. President Trump announced on Friday that he intended to nominate Representative John Ratcliffe, a Republican of Texas, as his Director of National Intelligence, choosing someone he had considered last summer before senior Republicans in Congress deemed him unqualified for the job. Mr. Ratcliffe is a vocal supporter of the president who serves on the House Intelligence Committee. Donald J. Trump, February 28, 2020. It is unclear whether Mr. Ratcliffe could be confirmed by the Senate. House Democrats inquire about political interference at the Justice Department. House Democrats are scrutinizing whether President Trump has improperly interfered at the Justice Department for political reasons, a prominent committee chairman said Friday, requesting documents and interviews with more than a dozen U.S. attorneys related to the cases of 3 Trump associates and a review of the FBI Russia inquiry. In the case of Mr. Stone, the president's remarks on Twitter blasting the judge and the Justice Department's lawyers for recommending too harsh of a sentence for his longtime friend and campaign advisor went so far that Mr. Barr delivered an extraordinary public rebuke, but only after senior department officials intervened to reverse the recommendation of career prosecutors and suggested a shorter sentence. Specifically, the committee asked for the department to brief lawmakers on each case hand over any communications with or referencing Mr. Trump or the White House related to them, and allow more than a dozen department prosecutors to sit for interviews. Border security is also health security, Trump says at rally, as coronavirus fear grows. Later, as authorities revealed a second person in California has been found to be infected with the coronavirus without having any known risk factors, President Trump suggested the panic over the issue was being manufactured by his enemies. Mr. Trump poll tested various candidates with the crowd. We won't include Steyer. He's a loser, before disparaging Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts as a mean one and dismissing Michael R. Bloomberg as gone and Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota as not going to happen. The president then asked his supporters what they thought of the weaker candidate, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, or Mr. Biden. You've been a damn good president, Mr. Graham then thanked the president for putting up with what the senator described as never-ending obstacles, though Mr. Graham could use an expletive instead. Later, as Mr. Trump spoke about immigration, he celebrated a federal appeals court ruling that determined that his administration would not have to provide funding for so-called sanctuary cities, and he recounted in grisly detail stories of an undocumented immigrant who had been arrested and charged with sexual assault and murder. Joe Biden's last stand. In North Charleston on Wednesday, Mr. Biden won the blessing of Representative James E. Clyburn, the most influential Democrat in the state, whose endorsement, while long expected by the political establishment here, nonetheless left Mr. Biden visibly moved, his mouth downturned as Mr. Clyburn spoke. Doesn't have a lot of money, said Carl Anderson, a state legislator, introducing him in Georgetown, though it was unclear if Mr. Anderson was referring to the Biden campaign, which could certainly use some cash from Mr. Biden's personal accounts, where he had fared just fine since leaving office. In front of crowds that are often more diverse and almost always more affectionate than those he encountered in the earliest states, Mr. Biden has also appeared more lively, more comfortable, and sometimes sharper. Here's how Tom Steyer's lavish spending divided South Kakalaka Democrats. Former state representative Fletcher N. Smith Jr., for example, said that he was offended when a staff member for Mr. Steyer came to his office in Greenville several months ago and suggested that he become a consultant for the campaign, an overture he interpreted as an attempt to purchase his support. Honestly, I'm not against Steyer's message, but he's in an enviable position, said Ms. Condon, who recently endorsed Pete Buttigieg, a former mayor of South Bend, Indiana. Certainly, Steyer's campaign has what most candidates wish for, unlimited money, Mr. Williams, the campaign advisor, said. I don't think any campaign worker should bring up anything about the foundations. He said Mr. Steyer and Ms. Taylor had removed themselves from foundation activities during the campaign. Elizabeth Warren has one black activist. She's losing the black vote. Don Calloway, a Democratic strategist specializing in field operations with black voters, said Ms. Warren's problems winning them over threaten the viability of her campaign moving forward, but should also serve a cautionary tale. The progressive activists who showered her candidacy with validation have a different electoral lens than the black electorate at large. The time coincided with a rough stretch in Ms. Warren's campaign nationally, including a downturn in polling, the departure of Ms. Warren, national organizing director, amid complaints of inappropriate behavior, the entrance of new Democratic candidates who snapped up some staff, and a fundraising slowdown that halted its ability to recruit new blood. Nalini Stamp, national organizing director for the Working Families Party, another progressive group that had endorsed Mrs. Warren, said that there's still time for Ms. Warren's popularity among well-known activists to pay off, pointing to voters who remain undecided. Sanders is stirring Cold War angst. Young voters say, so what? For years in Washington, those left-wing views defined and to some extent diminished Mr. Sanders, an independent congressman and then senator who is widely regarded as a quirky outsider to the Democratic establishment. Mr. Sanders' campaign does not view his remarks on Cuba or his history of praising socialist governments as problematic for him because it matters more to older moderate voters, a demographic Mr. Sanders already finds harder to reach. In states like California, where Mr. Sanders has devoted time and resources to reaching out to Latino communities, some older Democratic voters have come around to him. The extraordinary scale of Bloomberg's ads in 6 charts. Though Mr. Bloomberg averages a few in-person events per day and has a staff of 2,500 around the country, his sprawling campaign is powered by one of the most traditional weapons in a candidate's arsenal, the television ad. The breadth of Mr. Bloomberg's broadcast campaign is numbing. Mr. Bloomberg is attempting to turn his ad campaign into delegates in several ways, through an inundation of expensive markets with potentially responsive suburban population, with heavy spending in a state where you clearly lose the top-line battle but could still sneak in some delegates, or by simply domination of the airwaves. So while Mr. Bloomberg is unlikely to finish high in placement in many Super Tuesday states, his vast resources in a state like Minnesota can help amass some delegates. Making pitch to voters, Bloomberg peddles his experience in a crisis. On Friday, Mr. Bloomberg went after one of Mr. Trump's biggest vulnerabilities, the performance of the stock market, telling a crowd of several hundred in Memphis that the steep sell-off over the last several days was a direct result of the president's failure to reassure the country that he can lead. Investors, he said, were pricing the management incompetence of Mr. Trump into trading, which has officially pushed the market into a correction, a drop of 10% or more from its most recent peak. Mr. Bloomberg's record as mayor has been attacked during his time on the campaign trail by his critics and rivals, in part because of his own habit of misleading statements around controversial policies, such as stop and frisk policing tactic. Kathy Wilde, the president and chief executive of the Partnerships for New York City, said Mr. Bloomberg's struggles in selling as his record as mayor simply reflect his lack of political dexterity. Michael Bloomberg and the long history of misogyny towards mothers. Even in the archetypically feminine role of mother, women can find themselves the subjects of the old and storied hatred. The Or Libertine, the Marquis de Sade, fantasized about inflicting torture and murder upon pregnant women, mothers, and their infants. As the late feminist sociologist Miriam M. Johnson wrote in her 1990 book Strong Mothers, Weak Wives, the devaluation of women is not an inevitable reaction formation to women's prominence in early childcare. It is a choice. That her obvious intervention was needed on that count is an indictment of a warped moral framework as much as any odd fashion in psychology. Democrats, your time is running out. The Democratic field is badly flawed. Four septuagenarians, a sensible man who looks too young to shave. Two people who should have left the race weeks ago. Klobuchar got off one of the better lines Tuesday. If we spend the next 4 months tearing our party apart, we're going to watch Donald Trump spend the next 4 years tearing our country apart. You're tearing me apart! Mayor Pete is a delight. Intelligent. Quick on his feet. A man of faith, but also a man married to another man. And as such, a groundbreaker. Why Bernie scares me. To have our convictions knocked sideways by stronger arguments, fresh experiences, contrary evidence, maturing judgment, or simply the honesty of a second-guessing mind is how we become educated. The alternative is intellectual stagnation, puerility, and arrogance. It takes a fanatic or a fool to believe that the person who's most right is the one who almost never admits to being wrong. He isn't entirely letting go of Fidel's achievement either, even if it risks Florida's 29 electoral votes. Yes, literacy in Cuba, largely for the purposes of indoctrination, is high, and Sanders thinks he has a moral obligation to affirm this. This isn't just a callous comment. It reveals a whole substructure of political ignorance and moral idiocy that was altogether common among Sanders' wing of the political left, both in the U.S. and abroad. Some members of that wing, like Germany's Joschka Fischer, France's Bernard Kouchner, came honestly and openly to grips with their youthful errors, which commends them, and more important, change their minds on fundamental questions. Why the Taliban will never agree to a real peace deal. The Taliban leader with the most battlefield credibility is another deputy, Sir Juddin Haqqani, a leader of the shadowy Haqqani network that controls the Taliban's Peshawar-based Shura, with operations in northern, eastern, and central Afghanistan. There's another impediment to securing a real peace deal. Members of the Taliban's Qatar-based negotiating team are largely disconnected from and disrespected by the Taliban senior leadership. The lead negotiator, Sheikh Mohammed Abbas Stanikzai, is a career Taliban politician, not a warrior, who was replaced as deputy Taliban foreign minister in the late 1990s after his own falling out with the Taliban leadership. We don't really know how many people have the coronavirus. While federal officials in the United States want Americans to be ready for the virus, there are some important aspects of the spread about which we have little information, even though they have likely already been studied by scientists and officials. In China, in Japan, and elsewhere, the spread of the information about emerging infectious diseases needs to keep up with the new reality. Elizabeth Rosenthal, a former New York Times correspondent, is the editor-in-chief of Kaiser Health News, the author of An American Sickness, How Healthcare Became Big Business and How You Can Take It Back, and a contributing opinion writer. Responding to coronavirus in the U.S. and Asia, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, has spoken to the media in frank and honest terms about infectious diseases, including HIV, AIDS, influenza, measles, Ebola, and most recently, COVID-19. We should all be terrified if President Trump is moving to silence the most trusted voice on infectious diseases in the world at a time when the growing epidemic is threatening the United States. Whom do you trust for information about your health? Dr. Fauci, or President Trump, or Vice President Mike Pence? The flaw in intermittent fasting. The current one, the intermittent fasting, crosses the line between what some people have done out of necessity through time, and some do as a result of upbringing, situational restrictions, or biological signals. The new wrinkle is labels for multiple constellations of intermittent fasting, periodic fasting, time-restricted feeding, alternate day fasting, and the 5-2 diet. Intermittent fasting may seem attractive at first glance. Get ready, New York, the plastic bag ban is starting. New York is banning the distribution of single-use plastic bags statewide on Sunday, a move with ambitious goal of reducing the billions of discarded bags that stream annually into landfills, rivers, and oceans. The law forbids most businesses from handling out the thin bags that are ubiquitous in supermarkets, bodegas, and boutiques, making New York the third state to ban bags after California, where a ban has already changed the way millions of people shop, and Oregon, when one took effect last month. Newspapers, bags, garment bags, and bags sold in bulk, like trash or recycling bags, are also exempt. One St. Patrick's Day parade in New York still bans LGBT groups. We are in the parade in Queens. We are in the parade in Manhattan. We are in the parade in Brooklyn. Let us join the parade on Staten Island. The New York City Parade, held on March 17th in Manhattan, is the oldest and largest St. Patrick's Day parade in the world, with 150,000 marchers and 2 million spectators annually. The backlash has left parade organizers increasingly isolated as natural allies have sought to distance themselves, including the Catholic Church and the Ancient Order of Hibernians, an Irish Catholic fraternal order that many on Staten Island view as the parade's real organizer. Facing sex abuse claims, Buffalo Diocese declares bankruptcy. The Diocese of Buffalo filed for federal bankruptcy on Friday, becoming the latest entity to seek financial protection after 2019 state law allowed victims of historical childhood sexual assault to sue. The Catholic Diocese, the largest in upstate New York, cited the Child Victims Act in a statement posted on its website, saying that the maneuver was necessary to continue interrupted its mission throughout Western New York while working to settle claims with existing diocese assets and insurance coverages. In recent months, lawmakers in New York have suggested expanding the law to cover adult victims, as well as extending that window. Russia gets its Disneyland, a Cold War dream come true. Dream Island doesn't mind if you invoke Disneyland to describe the park, but we'll point out that there's no connection to the happiest place on Earth. In Russia, we say Disneyland when we mean just a theme park, some 60 years after the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev first floated the idea of building an analog to Disneyland. President Vladimir Putin stopped by to inspect the park on Thursday. In rare statement, Fed chair keeps rate cut on table as virus risk royal market. While the Fed chair said that the fundamentals in the U.S. economy remain strong, he also noted that the coronavirus poses evolving risk to the economic activity. and said that the Fed is closely monitoring developments and their implications for the economic outlook. Mr. Bullard's statement does not signal that the Fed will definitely cut interest rates at its mid-March meeting, but it lays out the sort of scenario that could prompt a Fed response. Mr. Bullard said he's optimistic that the virus can be contained, and said the Fed's rate cuts last year should help to protect the economy, which is currently growing steady. How bad could it get? Companies gauge the coronavirus impact. Some companies have expressed optimism that the government will curb new infections and that consumer spending in Europe and North America will be largely unscathed. Fear of the virus has prompted companies like Amazon and Nestle to suspend international travel by some employees. Some analysts now expect more companies could soon announce reductions in their capital spending. As coronavirus slams small businesses, a noodle shop fights for their life. The stone counters, where customers normally crowd at Pang Mei's noodle shop in Beijing, have turned into an assembly line of workers folding dumplings or measuring out noodles, sauces, and other ingredients into plastic containers. Pang Mei's noodle shop opened in 2015 in one of Beijing's distinctive alleyways known as Hutongs, offering pungent chili-soaked noodles in the style of Chongqing, the city in central China. Like most small shops and restaurants in Beijing, the couple planned to close for the holiday and reopen on February 6th. Coronavirus fears are driving interest rates down. A bad omen for the economy. The Fed's interest rate tools are poorly suited to protect the economy from shutdowns and production resulting from disease fears. Assuming the central bank indeed cuts rates to try to buffer the economy from damage, it would find itself with interest rates of around 1% or lower in an economy that is doing quite well, for the moment at least. The combination of low interest rates and large-scale deficit spending by the federal government has enough to keep the United States growing for more than a decade and has pushed the unemployment rate consistently below 4%. Right-wing media says virus fears were whipped up to hurt Trump. The coronavirus, from this standpoint, is compared to impeachment and the special counsel's report, major news events dismissed by Trump allies as hyped-up non-events. Senator Tom Cotton, an Arkansas Republican, floated the possibility in a Fox News interview that the coronavirus has originated at a Chinese laboratory, a theory that scientists say lacks any evidence. Sean Hannity, at the top of his Fox News program on Thursday, attributed the worries over the coronavirus to a fear campaign led by the media mob and the Democratic Extreme Radical Socialist Party. House votes to ban flavor in cigarettes and e-cigarettes. The House, taking aim at youth vaping and tobacco use, voted Friday to ban the sale of flavored cigarettes and e-cigarette liquids, even as civil rights advocates and some African-American Democrats raised concerns that the legislation unfairly targeted black people. 85% of African Americans who smoke menthol cigarettes. 75% of African American kids are vaping right now, vape menthol cigarettes. For decades, Big Tobacco has targeted African Americans with menthol cigarettes, with devastating consequences, the speaker said, reading aloud from the letter, which noted that the high death rates from lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, and other smoking-related illnesses among African Americans. Texas Tribune hires a new top editor. The Texas Tribune, a digital news platform founded in 2009, hired Stacey Marie Ishmael, a digital savvy journalist, as its new editorial director, the Tribune's chief executive said on Friday. Ms. Ishmael, 35, a veteran of the Financial Times, BuzzFeed, News, and Apple, will effectively replace Emily Ramshaw, the Tribune's editor-in-chief from 2016 until her departure in January. Joining Ms. Ishmael at the Tribune's headquarters in Austin will be Millie Tran, 30, the deputy off-platform editor at the New York Times. Cell phone carriers face $200 million fine for not protecting location data. The FCC is fining companies based on the number of days the practice carried on after initial reports, according to 3 people familiar with the full report, which has not been released. Despite being an unusually large penalty by the FCC standards, the proposed judgment is small compared with the company's revenues, which totaled more than $350 billion last year. Senator Ron Wyden, an Oregon Democrat who first raised concern about the data sharing and has repeatedly questioned the company and the FCC over the issue, said in a statement on Thursday that the amount was comically inadequate to deter future privacy violations. The flaw in Warren Buffett's estate plan. The trustee in turn argued that Charles Dumas, who created the trust in the 1950s and funded it with Kodak stock, was explicit in his desire that the trust not sell the stock. Once a trust is funded, those trustees are managing and distributing the money for an entity that is separate from Mr. Buffett or any other person who created the trust. If the person setting up the trust is determined to make it restrictive, advisors recommend setting up a directive. self-directed trust, which splits up the roles of the trustees and gives some rights to direct actions, and gives some the right to direct actions of others. That digital textbook your college has billed you for it. Students should always have the choice of how to pay, said Nick Sengstockin, a senior at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who is a member of the student government and an advocate for textbook affordability. Students can buy the electronic textbook for about $40 and a package that includes extra digital tools for about $60 to $80. Students in the company's inclusive access program pay less. High textbook prices have long been a bane for students, but students now have more workarounds. That has been Reading the Times. This is Saturday. My name is Shaz, and the day is February 29th, 2020.